Good afternoon. I am Satish Kumar Jha. In fact, today's lecture we are going to devote on this CEC Gurukul network on Rabindranath Tagore, political thought of Rabindranath Tagore. In fact, Tagore is one such modern Indian thinker who has inspired a whole host of people in 20th century. So much so that some thinkers of modern India like Gandhi who have had intense disagreement with Tagore, but nonetheless in fact it is believed that Gandhi himself acknowledged the contribution of Tagore in the evolution of modern India or rise of modern India. Tagore was a poet, philosopher, a creative thinker, a novelist, and therefore the kind of sweep he had, the wider canvas on which he operated, was really mind boggling. In fact, Tagore was born in 1861 and he died in 1941. It is a very crucial period in the life of the nation. In fact, he was a poet, thinker, creative personality rolled into one. In fact, his father Rabindranath Tagore himself was a very important social reformer of Bengal. In fact, one can say that the family of Tagore was full of scholars and social reformers as well as the entrepreneurs. So, therefore, in fact, his entire upbringing was in a very different type of milieu, social as well as familial milieu. In fact, the Brahmo Samaj background of the family mattered for the evolution of his entire approach towards social reforms. In fact, his grandfather was a close associate of Ram Mohan Roy, and family had started schools and many such charity institutions. Though in fact at times Tagore is also criticized for his class background, because Tagore's family came from a jamindari background. They were the jamindars of Bengal. In fact, as it is well known that jamindari system was a product of permanent settlement brought by the Britishers after Cornwallis introduced it in India, and Tagore's family was one of the beneficiaries of this system. So, therefore, at times his class background is highlighted by the critics and commentators, saying that some of his political ideas were colored by his class background, that was the jamindari background of his family. But one thing we should remember, and I will touch upon this issue later in course of our discussion, that when it came to the issue of jamindar representing the interest of Indian society, he not only opposed it, but also completely revised that argument that the jamindari system or the jamindars of India were the custodian of the interest of the people. And it is different matter that on issue of representation, in fact Tagore not only rejected the claim of jamindars to represent the interest of the people in India or Indian society, but also at the same time showed his reservation on the claim of the moderate, the middle class, the new middle class, educated middle class of India, who were basically gravitating towards Indian National Congress and were claiming the right to represent the interest of the Indian people. So, therefore, he was skeptical about both claims, the claims of zamindars and the claims of the newly educated middle class of India, and therefore he had altogether different vision about the future of India, the future reconstruction of society, future reconstruction of polity, and so on and so forth, which we will be looking at in course of our discussion. Now, coming to in fact the issues of education, and because this this is his childhood, early childhood, and also the mature Tagore, and later on a Tagore which became worldwide famous for his creation, for his philosophical sweep, and so on and so forth. Now, education and upbringing, these two things are considered always important when we discuss any thinker, be it Indian or Western, or for that matter any creative philosophical exercise, that what type of education a thinker had, what type of upbringing a particular philosopher had. And as we have already seen that the context of his social background was something very one can say affluent in context of India, came from a well off family. In fact, he was the 14th and the youngest child of a rich man of Bengal, as his family owned jamindari. In fact, he was educated mostly at home, and of course, he also acquired education through his extensive travels all over the world. That also I will mention in course of my lecture, because it was his trip to Europe, his trip to United States of America, Japan, China, Southeast Asia, which basically exposed him to different ideas outside India. He could see different culture, he could place Indian problem or Indian issues in context of the larger global situation. So therefore, in fact, this foreign travel was a very important source of learning so far as Tagore is concerned. In fact, he also spent his holidays with a brother in civil service and travelled far and wide in company of his civil servant brother, and that exposed him to different culture or distant culture which was not of his own society, that is Bengal. So therefore, that basically exposed him to the multicultural, plural, cultural and social milieu of India. In fact, regular trips to Europe also exposed him to modern Enlightenment values as well as the Renaissance Europe. So therefore, in fact, this important dimension in his personality, in his philosophy has to be understood. In fact, he was also admitted to school in England, but dropped out soon, and ultimately he relied on the self education. So therefore, this is something important so far as education and upbringing is concerned. Now, writings, of course, when we discuss the political thought of Tagore, then of course we have to essentially focus on his political ideas, but a creative thinker which he was, in fact his political ideas cannot be completely insulated from the larger issues he was engaged with, and many of them were cultural, many of them were philosophical and also social. So therefore, you have to take into account whole host of writings, even those writings were basically creative in nature. For example, his poems, in fact the novels, the plays and other things which he wrote. In fact, that is why at times he is referred as a thinker, philosopher, poet as well as novelist and a playwright. In fact, there are some political tracts which are in fact which have left a lasting impact on a lot of debates in India and outside, and one such tracts is of course his lectures on nationalism, which were delivered in course of his travel to United States of America, Japan and also Europe. And these lectures on nationalism is basically a great source, a treasure trove one can say, to understand this phenomenon called nationalism. Because as it is well known, and we will be looking at this issue, that Tagore was offered a very trenchant critique of nationalism, and therefore in fact at times his ideas, his thought is presented as one of internationalism, universalism and humanism, which basically rose above this identity or ideology called nationalism. So therefore, in fact this political writing is very important, that is on lectures on nationalism, particularly nationalism in Japan, nationalism in USA and nationalism in India. Of course, there were many other internationalists in India who also believed in similar humanism. One such thinker of personality was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. But Gandhi made some exception so far as Indian nationalism or nationalism of the oppressed people was concerned. He thought that right to self-determination of the oppressed nationalities were important to get space in the Committee of Nations. So therefore, in fact, he was ready to condone the excesses made in name of oppressed nationalism. That was the case with India, China and some other places. But in fact, Tagore was different. Tagore was unsparing in his criticism of nationalism. He thought that nationalism, be it of oppressed people or the subjugators or the oppressors, would eventually and definitely lead to violence would lead to sectarianism, would lead to many excesses, and that would be suicidal for humanity. So, therefore, this piece of writing is important. Of course, we will discuss more on nationalism later. Now, in 1880s, he published steady streams of poems, stories and novels, and in fact, one of them which later he himself translated as Gitanjali, and for which he was awarded Nobel Prize, first Asian to get this prize, this honor. In fact, 1912 he carried out himself the translation of his poems in England and showed it to the Irish poet W.B. Yeats, and later on this translation was published as Gitanjali, the great success, and as I mentioned that he was awarded Nobel Prize for this piece of writing. Now, of course, apart from the political tracts on nationalism, his collection of poems and many other things, Tagore also authored some political novels, and those novels are monumental. In fact, I would just make mention of three important novels which he wrote. One was Gora in 1909. In fact, it was basically many scholars believe that it was closest to the 19th century idea of a novel. So to say that Gora can be characterized as in real sense a novel, the way perhaps the literary figures analyze and look at novel in 19th century. Then of course, there are two more writings. In fact, apart from this Gitanjali which I have already mentioned, the Gora, the first important, not only first, because as I will tell you later that it was the sixth novel of Tagore. Then the next is the Ghore Bahar, as it is called in Bangla. In English this is translated as The Home and the World. It was published in 1916, and this Ghore Bahar is the eighth novel. And the third political novel is the Char Adhyay, which can be translated in English as 4 chapters, and this was the 13th and the last novel of Tagore, published in 1934. And in fact, interestingly, after publication of Char Adhyay, some sort of political controversy also erupted, and therefore it was basically it created some sort of storm. So therefore, these three important novels which I have already mentioned, the Gora, published in 1909, then you have this Ghore Bahar, The Home and the World, published in 1916, and then the Char Adhyay, the 4 chapters, published in 1934. So these are the political novels. Now, of course, so far as the themes in these novels are concerned, because as we are aware that he was a poet, philosopher, creative writer. In fact, he approached political issue at times indirectly, but Tagore is one such thinker who whose ideas are not difficult to understand. In fact, he does not arrive at his conclusion through a circuitous path. He basically addresses things directly, and that is the case also in the novels. But one thing, as I mentioned earlier, that being a creative thinker, a philosopher, man of literature, in fact some of his political ideas were forcefully expressed through these political novels, like Gora, Ghore Bahar and the Char Adhyay. In fact, the scholars argue that this Gora, this novel Gora, which is essentially about identity issue, that how loss and recovery of self happens through a circumstantial situation, that an Irish boy brought up in an Indian family and suddenly realizes after participating in a movement that he is not Indian, but nonetheless that through this story he is trying to narrate the larger recovery of self, that how he transcended these barriers and become a kind of internationalist, or one can say that humanist touch he is trying to bring in through recovery of the self, the original self, which is basically beyond and above this nationalist division of humanity. So therefore, so far themes are concerned, Gora, many observers believe that is basically the theme is political and psychological. This Ghore Bahar, it is called, it is believed that the theme is political psychological, and the Ghore Bahar, it is basically political sociological, and Char Adhyay, the theme is political ethical. So therefore, what happens that the three themes, the focus, the entire vantage point, the entry point in the three political novels are different. In Gora, political psychological, in Ghore Bahar, political sociological, and in Char Adhyay, it is political ethical. In fact, apart from these political novels, he also wrote songs, and some of the songs are basically sung in different parts of India and the world today. And interestingly, two of his songs have become the national anthem of two countries, India and Bangladesh. So therefore, this is something about his writing. So far as travels are concerned, as I mentioned that he was extensively traveling, and that was also a source of learning, that was also a source of his exposure to different ideas, and therefore the kind of humanism, universalism and internationalism which he basically embraced in course of the evolution of his thought, in fact were also on account of his exposure to different culture, different people and different societies. In fact, he had made 4 trips to USA, he had made many trips to Europe, several to Japan, China, Southeast Asia. In fact, in 1930 he traveled to Soviet Union, a new political arrangement after the Bolshevik revolution of 1917. He saw it through his own eyes, and that also left a lasting impact on the minds of Tagore. He was not someone who ever endorsed class war. He is not someone who ever endorsed violence. He is not he never endorsed the state supremacy or authoritarianism, but the kind of transformation he could see in Soviet Union with his own eyes after 1930, and the letters which he wrote to friends, the kind of endorsement he gave of the Soviet system was really interesting. So this travel to Soviet Union was an important event in his life. Now, as I mentioned earlier also, that these travels helped in reflecting on India's place in the world, because he is basically one thinker, modern Indian thinker, who always looked at Indian situation, Indian issues, Indian problems in larger global context, and therefore in fact these travels helped him a lot in this mission, and therefore in fact his take on these issues was more nuanced and well layered than many of his contemporaries. Of course, someone like Gandhi can also be compared on this count because of that nuanced and the layered understanding, but of course with lot of differences, and the differences were so much that they engaged in a very interesting debate, the Gandhi-Tagore debate, which I will also come to later part of our discussion. So of course, these things are important, but before I move on to particularly the tenets of his thought, it is important to remember that Tagore was also an institution builder, and these things are important in the evolution of a life of a thinker. Now, some of the institutions which he founded were also influenced by this quest for utopia, one can say, or quest for an alternative system, alternative knowledge system, quest for emancipation, quest for the freedom for the people. And one such institution which he helped founding was Shantiniketan, called Vishwa Bharati, in English one can say India in the world, 1921, because this was the period when many experiments were happening in the realm of knowledge and education in India. As we know that after the Swadeshi movement in Bengal, which also coincided with anti-partition movement, that is partition of Bengal 1905, the Swadeshi movement also led to the flowering of new ideas, new thought, particularly the Swadeshi in different spheres of life including education and knowledge led to the formation of many nationalist schools and colleges, and of course the another phase was the phase during the non-cooperation movement, when there was a call for boycott of the foreign goods, foreign institutions, foreign knowledge system, and it was around that time that many institutions were founded under the influence of Gandhi, including this Ahmedabad famous institution, university, Jamia Millia Islamia, and many other institutions. Now, around this time 1921, Tagore also founded this university called Shantiniketan, and through Shantiniketan he tried to convey his vision for the future of not only India, but humanity. And therefore, in fact, the kind of curriculum which he basically introduced in this university, Shantiniketan, Vishwa-Bharati, basically tried to bridge the gap between science and the humanities. And this Shantiniketan was basically an institution of its own type, where he tried to do many experimentation. So therefore, when today we discuss many experiments in Indian knowledge system in modern time, particularly in 20th century, in fact Shantiniketan stands out as a novel experiment of that period based on the philosophy of Tagore. So therefore, in fact this Shantiniketan, I mean, as institution builder, one can always remember Shantiniketan and this experiment of Tagore. In fact, of course, one thing is important here to remember, that Tagore was also great critique of Western education, the English education, the way it was basically introduced in India, the way Indian people were cut off from their own reality, the kind of knowledge they were acquiring, which were basically strangulating Indian culture and creative thinking of the Indian people. There is a famous a reference in which he mentions that how this modern English education introduced by Macaulay in 1835 led to a situation where if an Indian child is basically sitting on the bank of Sangam in Allahabad, Prayag, even then if he is asked to write about a river facing the Sangam, he would think about Thames. So this is the kind of detachment people have suffered with their culture, with their surroundings under the influence of this knowledge system, and therefore he was also engaging with this exercise of coming out with an alternative. But one thing is important, that in this Shantiniketan, as I mentioned, he tried to bridge the gap between the science and humanities. In fact, he also gave a special focus on the study of China and Japan, and therefore in fact what happened, that this China and Japan always remained very important for Tagore throughout his life, because he thought that China and Japan, particularly Asian nations and their culture, India can learn a lot. Not only India, but they can both learn from each other. And therefore, on issue of Japan, he had all praise for Japan, particularly the way they synthesized, or one can say made use of the Western industrialism or idea of industrialism and technology, and harmonized its own culture. But later on, when it came to nationalism, in fact Tagore also became a critic of Japanese nationalism, and saying that though initially they did a great job by harmonizing culture and technology and Western materialism or Western industrialism, but on issue of culture they succumbed to that seduction, temptation, and lost the track. So of course we will come to this issue when we will discuss nationalism. So in this Shantiniketan, he also started an institution for rural reconstruction, and thereby he tried to answer his critics who were saying that it was basically elitist in nature. So therefore this rural reconstruction was part of his larger focus so far as the curriculum in Shantiniketan is concerned. Political influences on Tagore's thought are also important to remember, because of course he was not a political being. In fact, his engagement with politics was always indirect, in the sense that he reflected on the political situation of his time, but he was not an activist, he was not a professional politician. So nonetheless, the political influences were important on him, and some of those influences we have to to keep in mind. The first important influence in fact on Tagore was the rise in the functions of the modern state in the West, and this perhaps became very important, particularly in terms of the evolution of Tagore's ideas on nationalism also. And the second important influence was the First World War, which had a devastating impact world over, and it was around this First World War that Tagore started analyzing both imperialism and colonialism and tried to contextualize this nationalism in the context of this imperialist war, which he thought that First World War was. Interestingly, in fact, this First World War was also called an imperialist war by a very famous Marxist thinker, revolutionary Lenin, when he authored a book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. But of course, his take was altogether different in terms of the rise of capitalism and the division of the world into markets and the competition among these capitalist nations for the new markets and so on and so forth. But of course, Tagore didn't take that trajectory, or didn't do a materialist interpretation of history the way Lenin did, but nonetheless First World War was also analyzed by Tagore as an imperialist war, and he believed that it was basically the fallout of the rise of nationalism and the way modern nation states have emerged in the West. And therefore, this greed for power, these material greeds are basically incessant, and therefore these greeds ultimately lead to such violent event in history, and First World War was seen by him as one such event. And therefore, this was a very important influence on him so far as his take on nationalism is concerned. The third important political influence was the militant nationalism in Bengal. In fact, as it is believed that he not only sympathized but actively observed this Swadeshi movement, anti-partition movement. One cannot say that he was a participant, but nonetheless observer, a sympathizer, and also he endorsed it. And in fact, this Tilak, who had emerged as a very important voice of Indian nationalism at that time, particularly against the moderate section in Indian National Congress, who were basically believing in prayer petition and pressure tactics in politics. In fact, Tagore was greatly influenced by the personality of Tilak and Aurobindo and such militant nationalists in India in 20th century. And therefore, in fact, in one of his writing, in fact, he presents a character who resembles the character of Tilak also. So therefore, Bairagi, the character of a Bairagi, in one of his creative writing. So therefore, this influence of Tilak was massive on Tagore. And then of course, this anti-partition movement I have already mentioned was another important influence on him. Some of the political associations we have to mention, though he was not a political person, but nonetheless he had some association, or one can say affiliation with some associations, either by participation or attendance. One was at Hindu Mela in 1875, the Calcutta session of Congress he attended in 1886 after the foundation of Indian National Congress in 1885, and then went on to attend it in 1896 and also 1906. So therefore, the three Congress sessions he attended, particularly those which were basically held in Calcutta. Then of course, the Bengal Provincial Congress in Nator, and in 1897 the Pabna 1908, and the prominent role in the anti-partition movement, as I mentioned, was another important affiliation or association, one can say, with the political event. In fact, Tagore was a keen and a critical observer of the struggle for freedom. He was keeping track of the multiple strands in Indian national movement and multiple ideologies. In fact, therefore, what happened that a time came when Tagore started critiquing not only the alien rule of which he was, in spite of the fact that he had reservations on the nationalism, particularly the way Indian National Congress was basically rising, one can say the mobilizing people on issue of nationalism. But nonetheless, he thought that alien rule was detrimental to the growth of the Indian people. but at the same time he was also unsparing in condemnation of the failing of the countrymen, because he thought that the countrymen were also not doing great service to the Indian cause, because they were completely ignoring the societal dimension, the social reforms, the kind of disunity which prevailed here, and therefore in fact what was happening, that they were ignoring a very important dimension of Indian civilization and Indian culture. In fact, he placed the misfortune of country in the global perspective of imperialism, and he had this regret that the India was also falling in this trap of global hysteria of nationalism. So therefore, in fact this is something important to remember, and it is here that one can see that how his critique of nationalism started taking firm shape. Now, political ideas, coming to political ideas after these political associations also is important. In fact, as I mentioned, that politics was not his the first preoccupation. He was not a political person, but nonetheless he never shunned politics. In fact, he got involved in great debates of his time, and some of the debates which were civilizational debates, one can put it, those debates did not have relevance or application or applicability or utility only for that time. Those debates are still remembered, those debates are still referred, and those debates are still important, because that pertain to civilizational issues, that pertain to humanity, and therefore in fact his involvement in these debates is to be seen. Now, 2-3 important debates which he engaged with and are worth remembering. Number one, he basically participated in a debate which started after this boycott of goods and institutions, that how far that is sustainable, how far that is endorsable, how far that is to be that is to be adopted. So therefore, the first important debate was after boycott of goods and institutions, and this happened on 2 occasions: during the Swadeshi and boycott movement, anti-partition movement 1905, another during non-cooperation movement when Gandhi arrived on the scene. And what we find, that the later debate which he had with Gandhi on this entire approach to nationalism was also basically the product of this event. Then of course, the second important debate was on the pristine value of the Indian culture, that how Indian culture has to be approached, how Indian culture has to be rescued from both Indian Indian people as well as from the alien rule. So this was the second important debate, and the third was of course the mendicancy of the Congress politics, particularly the moderates. As I mentioned, that they believed in 3 P's: pressure, prayer, petition, petition, prayer, petition and pressure, and that approach was called an approach of mendicancy. And Tagore was basically ruthless in his criticism of this mendicancy on Congress. In fact, at the same time, he also got involved in a debate on this extremism of the young revolutionaries of Bengal, because Tagore always detested violence, and therefore this romantic extremism of the young people in Bengal unnerved him, and he thought that this was something which was going to this vicious cycle, this a spiral chain, and therefore this will be against the human values, and therefore this was another important moment so far as his engagement with important issues of his time is concerned. And then of course, and the most important was this hollowness of Western materialism. Of course, when he opposed Indian nationalism, particularly the way it was basically mobilizing people, creating hysteria around this mass psychology called nationalism. In fact, many critics thought that he was being apologetic of imperialist rule. He was supporting the imperialist rule, but that was not the case. He was a great patriot, but nonetheless he believed that falling in this trap of nationalism would not liberate and emancipate Indian people, because you will be ultimately imitating the same value system which West has generated and which is leading to this Holocaust all over the world. So therefore, this hollowness of Western materialism was another important reference point in his philosophy and his thought, along with this aggressive nationalism. So, therefore, these were the some of the important debates of his time with which he engaged. And then of course, one should remember the broad world outlook which he nurtured was purely philosophical and also creative. In fact, as I mentioned, that his ideas were very clear and straightforward. Now, one thing is important that on issue of this politics, because at times the critics point out or debate the issue of politics or anti-politics. At times it is his ideas are referred to be anti-politics, because he condemned nationalism, he condemned anything which involved collective action or mobilization, which was done by Gandhi through non-violent means, but nonetheless he was also not comfortable with this, saying that it is basically leading to mass hysteria, a psychological playing on the psychology of the people. So, therefore, politics, anti-politics issue. In fact, but nonetheless, as I mentioned, that not a political person, but engaged with politics intensely. What compulsion pushed him to this political arena? That is important. Now, the context of his time at times is referred. What was the context? The first is the permanent settlement, as his family was the beneficiary of permanent settlement, the Jamindari system, and then the educational opportunities which were created by the Britishers after 1835. These two contradictory things, that a new class of the Jamindars and the new opportunities which were emerging for the upper class and upper caste of India, that basically created a context of his dilemmas, of his reflection on number of issues of his time. But at the same time, this class to which he belonged, and later on one can say that he also tried to declass himself by condemning the excesses of the Jamindari system, by turning down their claim to represent the Indian people. But at the same time, he was also skeptical about the claim of the new middle class, the educated middle class, to speak for the Indian people, because he thought that they were totally cut off from the masses, and therefore he thought that the only politics which has a future, who basically comes from the from the masses, from the roots of the society. So, therefore, this master slave relationship, which was the result of this colonization, was another important dimension for his engagement with politics, and therefore one can say that he was not anti-politics, but his politics was different. It was not mundane, driven by material interests. It was not a politics driven by the quest for power. His politics was driven by the quest for emancipation, freedom, and liberation. And of course, all these things were also colored by great sense of disappointment with Western liberalism, because Western liberalism, which basically claimed to represent a modern values, enlightenment values, values of reason and rationalism, in fact it came as a great sense of disappointment to a thinker like Tagore, because he thought that on the one hand this entire Western discourse was geared towards nationalism and imperialism, and thereby leading to this violent actions all over the world. So, therefore, in fact, one should remember that his politics was different, both in terms of his approach and content, and the plight of the people, that is the poverty, in fact, and absence of liberty. In fact, these two were also another important reference point his thought, because he always believed that the problem is essentially social, and then basically eventually it becomes political. So, therefore, his politics was something which was geared towards social change and social reform. Now, social sphere was always more important in his political thinking, than perhaps it was assigned by any other person in India, perhaps with sole exception of Gandhi. And therefore, in fact, many political theorists, many political scholars, political observers, they believe that civil society, which has of late made a powerful comeback in political theory, one can say that how Tagore was basically looking at this issue, that ultimately the freedom, the real freedom, spiritual as well as human freedom, is basically part of the civil society discourse. The state cannot deliver on this freedom and liberation. So, therefore, in fact, he always believed that and always thought that there were two evils of humanity. One is the social oppression, particularly in India. The social oppression, of course, was basically synonymous with the caste system, which was responsible for indignity of men, and he believed that those nationalists in India who were only focusing on freedom from the alien rule were ignoring this issue. And then, of course, another evil was foreign domination. So, therefore, in fact, Tagore's entire plea was to change the social psychology of the people instead of changing the psychology of rulers, which the moderates initially tried to do through National Congress and National Movement. Tagore's plea was to change the social psychology of the people. He was worried about the hypnotic spell cast by the extremist terrorist outfit in Bengal, and therefore, he in the same breath opposed two things: the romantic adventurism of the young people, and at the same time the violence born out of this intolerance towards different things, including the foreign rule and so on and so forth. So, therefore, in fact, he was against creating a mystique around this patriotism to intoxicate people, to inebriate people, and therefore, in fact, this mystique of patriotism, which was basically he observed was happening in India also, the way it had happened in the West, particularly in 20th century, made him totally uncomfortable, and therefore, he thought that only way to emancipate people is to work with them and particularly rouse them, particularly through a mass movement. Now, it is here this debate with Gandhi, which I referred earlier also, is important to mention, that he differed with Gandhi in spite of great expectation from him. In fact, it is to be remembered that it was he who gave this title to Gandhi, the Mahatma, and Mahatma called him Gurudev. So, therefore, there was a sense of mutual respect between the two. But one thing is also important to remember, that both are seen as a great humanist and internationalist in India or world over, particularly from the point of view of their thought, but nonetheless their take was different. Gandhi always thought the right to self determination of the oppressed nationalities, oppressed people like India, were important to find a respectable place in the Committee of Nations, and thereby only they could play important role in world affairs, and thereby they could rescue the human values. But Tagore thought that be it nationalism, be it of the oppressed or the oppressor, would eventually lead to this unending chain of violence, and therefore there was no space for this. So, in fact, his mind revolted against symbolic, sporadic and short-lived promises of self-sufficiency, which was promised by Gandhi's Charkha movement. Now, one thing we should remember, that he was uncritically against this such thing, and therefore he always feared that Mahatma's charisma was compelling people to accept his words on face value. In fact, there was animated debate between Gandhi and Tagore in 1921. He also attacked Gandhian untruth on public mind about impurity of Western textile, and he thought that it was simply meant to sustain political agitation, which was not done. And on issue of earthquake, when in 1934, when Gandhi said that it was basically a result of the practice of untouchability, in fact, he didn't endorse it. In fact, he thought this parochial anti-West tendency will damage cooperation and international community. So, therefore, we find that there are a lot of disagreement and convergence between Gandhi and Tagore, but on issue of nationalism they came sharply. So, on the whole, we can say that Tagore was a thinker who was ahead of his time and could see the danger of nationalism, which today's world we can see face to face, and therefore, in fact, he is one of the important thinker, though people say he was utopian, poetic, not political, but I think the contributions he has left today, particularly in terms of the importance of society vis-a-vis state, is worth remembering.